Hi everyone, my name's Darcy Kulai, and my talk is When Grit Isn't Great. When I got the email about this year's TED Talk, I thought, maybe that's something I can do. I've just done a video with WorkSafe BC, and I've been on the news talking about the high injury rates of young workers around the province. When I thought about my injuries, I realized there's two types of healing, physical and emotional. It took about a year for me to heal physically from my wounds, but my emotional healing is ongoing. Grit is generally great, and people respond to us when we display it. But when isn't it great? When I was 20 years old, I was involved in a very serious workplace accident. I was working at a sawmill, stationed at an area called the stick belt, where sticks from the loads of lumber would feed out to be stacked. Underneath the stick belt was a chain that drove it. Picture like a large bicycle chain. On one end of the chain, I noticed there were some broken sticks, so I reached in with my left hand to pull them out. But as I did, my glove got snagged in the chain and I got sucked in. There was a loud popping sound as my thumb broke. I couldn't reach the stop button, and nobody could hear my cries for help in the noisy mill. So I started pulling on the chain with my right hand, reefing on it, trying to free up my left. I was still fighting, but then my right hand got sucked up the other end of the chain, and the fight was over. I woke up the next day in a hospital bed and looked down, and my right hand was gone, and my left hand was heavily bandaged, especially my thumb. My right hand was so damaged that they had to amputate it during the night, but they saved a couple bones and they used it to rebuild my left thumb. I was planning to move down to Victoria that September with some friends and play basketball at Camosun College. But plans had changed and I was moving home with my parents. They had to do everything for me for the next couple months. It was like being a small child again. It was very, very hard, but I got through it. I don't remember much about this time, but I do remember people thinking that I was doing very well with everything. In fact, many people would say if their kid got hurt, they hope they can handle it as well as me. When I went over to the Richmond WorkSafe BC hospital, sorry, that slide just popped. They asked me if I'd ever want to speak in front of an audience about my experiences because I seemed to be doing so well. I gave that a hard no. I just didn't want to talk about it at all. Fast forward 25 years and I was having all sorts of troubling health symptoms. I was doing the Western medicine thing, but then one day a friend suggested I go talk to a therapist she knew who was a holistic healer. Holistic healing is when the whole person is treated and not just the symptoms. And it was completely foreign to me, but I was just desperate at the time, so I decided to give it a go. During our first session, she asked me about my accident, and I gave her some details. Then she asked me how it made me feel, and I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, how did losing your hand make you feel? And I said, it didn't really make me feel anything at all. And she said, how is that possible? So then we continued chatting, and I finally admitted something to her that I'd never admitted to anyone else. I told her it made me feel like a freak and a total screw-up. When I was over in Richmond at the hospital, I met all sorts of different people who had been injured like me. Some were badly scarred, some were missing limbs, and some were in wheelchairs. Some were all of the above. The one guy that made the biggest impression on me had lost both of his arms up to his shoulders. He told me a bit about what it was like for him to move through the world and how people responded to him. He said that kids were the toughest, and that some would point and laugh at him while others would start crying. He said he preferred the laughing. I had lived a fairly sheltered existence after my accident up until that point, so I couldn't really relate. But once I got back out there in the world, I definitely had a lot of these experiences, and they were tough. Tim Fisher is a Canadian trauma counselor, and he talks about our logical and emotional brains. Have you guys ever been in a situation where you're just feeling bothered or agitated and you don't understand why? Like you're in a situation you feel like you can handle, everything seems cool, but there's just something off. Well, what's happening here is our logical brain is telling us that everything's good, but our emotional brain is telling us it's not. So if I'm out there and a kid comes up to me and he points and laughs, or he looks squeamish, or he calls his friends to come over and look at me, I can tell myself, oh, he's just a kid, they don't know any better. This shouldn't bother you, you're an adult, but it does, every single time. Same thing with right handshakes. The right handshake is such a huge part of our culture, and when you don't have one, it leads to all sorts of awkward exchanges. And I can tell myself, come on, man, it's been like 28 years, this shouldn't bother you anymore. But it does, and the reason it does, I know now, is because it triggers my emotional brain and all the emotional wounds I haven't healed yet. One day I was talking to my therapist and my dad came up. He has all the same health symptoms as me and then some. She asked me if I thought it was all genetic and if I was going to end up just like him. And I said, yes, I did. Then she asked me how my dad dealt with stress and emotion. And I thought about that for a second and then said, not very well. And she said, have you ever considered the possibility that you and your dad have all the same symptoms because you deal with stress and emotion the same way? And I said, no, I hadn't. It was around this time that I started reading this book. It's called I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terrence Real. The subtitle is Overcoming the Secret Legacy of Male Depression. In this book, Terry talks about some of the patients he treats, and they've all fit a similar mold. They're depressed males, their families can't stand them, and they use a variety of methods to cope with their depression, such as drugs, work, and alcohol. Terry begins treating them, and they begin to open up about their experiences and describe some of their experiences to Terry that have shaped them from their childhood. When they're feeling better and the time is right, Terry invites the families into the sessions, and the men begin to share these experiences with their families. The families finally begin to see their dad as a human being and start to feel compassion for him for sometimes the very first time. So how do these guys get like this? Well, Terry goes on to explain that when boys and girls are born, they basically feel and express emotion the same way. But this can begin to change at a very early age. Boys learn that when they're tough, hardworking, and hold their emotion in, they receive more positive attention, especially from their fathers. Crying and talking about their feelings is not as well received. Although with girls, it is sometimes more socially acceptable. Then when something bad happens to these guys, they have a really hard time dealing with it because they're so used to holding everything in. As I'm reading this book, it finally just hits me. Oh my God, I'm one of these dudes. For as far back as I can remember, my focus has been on trying to appear strong and unemotional, especially when dealing with tough times. And I realized why back then everyone thought I was doing so well, because I wasn't crying or talking about it. But what hit me the hardest was realizing what kind of father I'd been to my son up until that point. I just had such a hard time anytime I thought he was being soft or slacking off or being too emotional. Tons of shame just washed over me for the next few days. My son was 16 at the time, and I knew I needed to talk to him about this, but I just couldn't do it. Then one day in therapy, she asked me how I was doing with the death of my parents. My dad had just passed away, and my mom had passed away a few years before. Then she asked me how my son was doing with the loss of his grandparents. And I said, "Oh, I think he's doing pretty good. He doesn't really talk about it." Yes, I said this right after I finished reading this book, so the lessons hadn't quite sunk in yet. So anyways, we planned a trip to Vancouver. Me and my son went down to the hotel pool for a swim, and then we made our way to the hot tub. It was just me and him, and I finally asked him, "Hey man, how are you doing with the loss of your grandparents?" And he said he was doing okay, but that he would dream about them at night sometimes and wake up crying. And I asked him why he never told me that before. And he said he knew I was sad and he didn't want to upset me anymore. This wasn't a huge surprise at the time, but it was still very hard to hear. I told him that showing emotion, especially crying, is one of the strongest and healthiest things he can do. And I told him that if I ever gave him the impression that it wasn't, I'm sorry. Then I told him that I loved him and that I would always be there for him, two things I'd never told him before. Around this time, I was chatting with my friend Dan, who is a health and safety officer. And he gave me some data on the high injury rate of young workers around the province. And it had an impact on me. He asked me if I have any interest in getting involved in injury prevention. And when I said yes, he put me in touch with WorkSafe BC. After a few meetings, they decided they wanted to make a video on me, so they sent a crew over to the island. You can find the video on their WorkSafe, on the WorkSafe BC YouTube channel, and part of it is filmed right here in Brentwood. And it features cameos by current basketball stars Jackson Lust, Jackson Lenarchich, and Rudolph Kruger, plus Coach Gage. I don't know if any of them are here, but can't really see, but hopefully one or two. During the interview portion, they asked me some very tough questions. The toughest one being, what would it feel like if your son was in an accident like you? He was 20 years old at the time and the same age as me when I got injured. I had never thought about that before. And when I did, I completely fell apart in front of the film crew. But I knew right then I was going to do, if there's anything I can do to reduce the number of these devastating injuries, I was going to do it. Just want to share some stats with you guys quickly here. Nearly 7,000 young workers ages 15 to 24 are injured on the job annually in BC. More than half the serious injuries happen in the first 6 months of a young worker's employment. Young male workers face a 48% higher risk of injury than the general working population. So why are these injuries happening? Inexperience and not being aware of potential hazards, lack of training or understanding of safety policies and procedures, reluctance to ask questions or raise safety concerns, not putting safety first above everything else. All of this applied to me. All of it. But the thing that hurt me the most was having no understanding of how sideways things can go and how quickly that can happen if you don't follow proper safety procedures. At my mill, if you were going to work on the stick belt, you were supposed to turn it off first. I knew that, I just didn't do it. I probably thought it was a silly rule or that it would just slow me down. So I didn't bother, and I paid a really steep price for it. And I also didn't understand that while gloves can protect you from a lot of things, around moving machinery, they're actually a hazard because they can get sucked in. And there are other factors as well. I was working alone, there was no guard on the chain, and it was late at night, like after midnight. All of these things should have made me more vigilant, more careful, but I was oblivious. It took me a very long time to admit that I should have pressed that stop button because there was just so much shame around it, and it made me feel horrible about myself. But the more I talked about it and learned about why these accidents happen, the better I began to feel about things. I realized I wasn't just some stupid kid who had done something horrible and completely ruined his life. I was just a young, inexperienced worker, and I made a mistake. And I began to feel compassion for myself for the very first time. Self-compassion is the practice of being kind and supportive to oneself when experiencing suffering or failure, rather than engaging in harsh self-criticism. To illustrate, I want you all to imagine you're on a basketball team. Your team is down 1 with 10 seconds left. Your coach draws up a slick play and you execute it flawlessly. You get exactly the shot you want by the player you want, but when they step up to shoot, they miss, and they miss badly. In fact, it's an air ball. As your team trudges off the floor and slumps down onto the benches in the change room, all the heads are hanging low. All except one, the player that missed the shot. They're smiling and patting other players on the back and saying, "Good game." You snap at them. "What are you talking about? It wasn't a good game, we lost." And they say, "I know, but I thought we played pretty well." And you say, "How can you say that?" And they just shrug and keep smiling at you. And eventually you can't take it. So you blurt out, "And you missed the biggest shot, and you don't even seem to care." And they say, "No, I care, but I did a lot of other really good things. I played some good D, made some great passes, and I got like 7 or 8 rebounds. I know I missed a big shot, but everything else was great." Can you guys even imagine a teammate talking like that? I know I've never seen it. It's so much more common for us to kick the crap out of ourselves every time we mess up or make a mistake. And it's so much more socially acceptable, isn't it? Like, people think you're weird if you don't do it or that you don't care. But what's really going on here? This teammate's just practicing self-compassion. And that's a beautiful thing. One day I was talking to a good friend of mine about all the various issues I was having. And he said, "You know, all these things, all of them, they're just drops in the ocean." The more I thought about that analogy, the more I liked it. We are all oceans. And while the surface can seem rough and wavy or calm and smooth, there's always so much more going on underneath. And these drops can seem really big and awful. And they're usually things we really, really don't like about ourselves, or that we wish were different, or that no one else could see. And they can consume us if we let them. And they can really mess with our relationships. When all we can see in ourselves is the stuff we really don't like, we don't know why anyone would want to be around us or be with us. Like, don't they see what's going on here? Like, how can this not bother them? There must be something wrong with them. But then one day, a friend of yours shares an analogy, and you finally realize it. Oh, wait, there is nothing wrong with them. They just see the ocean. So why can't I do that? Well, maybe I can. Grit is a great thing. I would never argue that. But when you're more concerned with looking gritty than actually healing your wounds, well, that's not a good thing. We need to be honest with ourselves, and when things aren't going well, we need to be able to talk about it and express our emotions. For me, physical healing is hard, but emotional healing is way harder. Definitely the grittiest thing I've ever tried. It's still a work in progress, but for me it all starts with self-compassion, being kind to myself. I'm still a long way from that fictional basketball player I described, but I'm getting closer. To end it off, I'm wondering if we can all do a quick exercise, if you'll indulge me. I want you all to close your eyes. Now I want you to imagine the tide washing in and out over a sandy beach. I want you to breathe in slowly as the tide comes in. Exhale slowly as it comes out. Now I want you to think about something about yourself that you really, really don't like, that you wish no one else could see, that you wish you could change. Breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly. Now I want you to say to yourself internally, I am an ocean, and this thing I really don't like about myself is just a little drop. Inhale slowly, exhale slowly. Now I want you to say to yourself internally again, I am an ocean, and there's so much more to me than this little drop. Now open your eyes. Thanks, everyone.